Look closely at this image. This is what remains of a tunnel after being ravaged by a relentless inferno. Inside this structure, 39 people met the most desperate end imaginable. They were subjected to temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius, roasted for 53 agonizing hours. A passage built for convenience was transformed into a massive incinerator, leaving nothing behind of the victims. This tragedy wasn't triggered by a high-speed collision or a deliberate act of violence. The true cause was a tiny, seemingly insignificant act. Something many men have done, and perhaps someone standing right next to you is doing at this very moment. The site of this disaster is the Mont Blanc Tunnel. As the name suggests, it was carved beneath the foot of Mont Blanc. Rising 4,805.59 meters, it is the undisputed monarch of the Alps. In French, it is known as the White Peak, and in Italian, the White Mountain. The dual naming exists because the summit lies in France, while the other end of the tunnel exits into Italy, a single mountain peak spanning across two nations. This geography meant that for these two countries to trade, or for their people to connect, they previously had to endure a grueling 7-hour drive on winding mountain roads. You would set out in the morning, and by the time you arrived, the workday was already over. To bridge this gap and foster economic growth, France and Italy joined forces. Construction began in 1958 and 1959, with teams drilling from both sides toward the center. It took 3 years of battling solid rock to finally meet in 1962, and another 3 years to complete the infrastructure. In 1965, the tunnel was officially opened. Stretching 11.6 kilometers long, 8.6 meters wide, and 4.35 meters high, it was the longest tunnel in the world at that time. Unlike the one-way tunnels we are accustomed to today, Mont Blanc was a two-way, single-lane tunnel. Although it lacked a grand appearance, it was a super project equipped with the most advanced safety features of its era. There was an SOS phone every 150 meters, a fire shelter every 600 meters, and a state-of-the-art ventilation and monitoring system. Specialized rescue teams were stationed at both ends, ready for any emergency. For 33 years, this system worked flawlessly. There were no major accidents, and the few minor fires that occurred were quickly extinguished. But in March 1999, an unheralded disaster, one that no one could have predicted, showed the world the true terrifying power of a tunnel fire. It was Wednesday, March 24th, 1999, a normal working morning. At 10:46 a.m., a refrigerated truck loaded with cargo entered the tunnel. The driver was Gilbert, a 57-year-old Belgian with 25 years of experience behind the wheel. The Mont Blanc Tunnel was a route he knew well. His mission was to deliver 9 tons of margarine and 12 tons of flour to a food processing plant in Milan. For the first 2 kilometers inside the tunnel, everything was normal. The truck cruised at a steady 60 kilometers per hour. However, as Gilbert drove deeper into the mountain, something strange began to happen. Drivers behind him started honking their horns and flashing their high beams. He might have thought they were just impatient, which is understandable in a narrow tunnel. But then oncoming drivers began doing the same thing, honking and flashing their lights. At that same moment, the smoke alarms inside the tunnel began to wail. Between the flashing lights, the honking, and the piercing alarms, any normal person would have stopped to investigate. But this veteran driver didn't care. He doubted everything around him, except the condition of his own truck. Wrapped in a mysterious blanket of overconfidence, he continued driving his ticking time bomb deeper into the heart of the tunnel. When he reached the middle of the tunnel, control centers in both France and Italy spotted thick smoke on their monitors and received smoke alerts. However, operators on both sides assumed it was just engine exhaust. In a tragic moment of silent agreement, they chose to ignore it and took no action. By 10:51 a.m., the smoke became undeniable. Gilbert finally saw the thick plumes in his rearview mirror. He stopped the truck and grabbed an extinguisher. But he was hauling margarine. Anyone who cooks knows that once oil catches fire, it is nearly impossible to put out with a standard extinguisher. You can smother a small pan fire with a lid or use cold oil to drop the temperature, but you should never use water. Facing 9 tons of burning fat, Gilbert's small extinguisher was useless. More tragically, his sudden stop allowed the flames to backflow into the trailer. The 12 tons of flour triggered a dust explosion, turning the entire vehicle into a massive fireball. Without a second thought, Gilbert turned and ran for his life. At 10:55 a.m., the Italian control center finally received an emergency report and notified France. They immediately closed both entrances, but it was far too late. There were approximately 40 vehicles trapped inside. On the French side, 9 cars and 18 trucks were stuck directly behind Gilbert's Inferno. Lacking experience in such a massive fire, the Italian control center turned on the ventilation fans to clear the smoke. This was a catastrophic mistake. Instead of helping, it pumped fresh oxygen into the fire and pushed the toxic smoke through the tunnel at a speed of 16 kilometers per hour. People trying to flee on foot couldn't outrun it. The furthest anyone managed to run was 500 meters. With their strength failing, they had only one choice: retreat into the fire shelters. It was a decision that led to a nightmare, feeling like they were being cooked inside a pressure cooker. By 10:56 a.m., the French rescue team entered, but after only 2 kilometers, they were met with total darkness. Their fire engines stalled as the fire consumed all the oxygen. Contact was lost between the rescue team and the control center near shelters 13 and 17, still 3 kilometers from the fire's source at shelter 22. Meanwhile, the Italian rescue team pushed 5 kilometers in, only to be pushed back by a wall of heat and exploding debris as car windows and fuel tanks shattered in the confined space. They finally realized why the French team had vanished. The conditions inside were a black hole for any living thing. 30 minutes after the fire started, France raised the emergency level to the maximum. More firefighters and helicopters were dispatched. However, tests showed that the core of the fire had reached nearly 1,200 degrees Celsius. Nothing could survive for a second in that environment. Everything except the rock itself melted, including the people in the shelters. The fire doors were only designed to withstand 800 degrees. The shelters had become natural ovens carved into the stone. Rescuers realized that continuing the search was meaningless and would only cost more lives. That afternoon, both nations officially abandoned the rescue effort. On March 26, 1999, 53 hours after the fire began, rescuers finally re-entered. The scenes they encountered were unforgettable. Melted metal everywhere, bodies burned to charcoal, and a floor glowing red from the heat. The tunnel was a literal purgatory. Some victims were fused to their steering wheels. Mothers were found holding children whose outlines were no longer visible. Others were found near floor-level air vents, having spent their final moments trying to breathe. In total, 39 people died. 29 were burned alive in their cars, while others were found in the shelters or on the escape route. Tragically, one of the first French firefighters to enter was among those who perished in a shelter. Gilbert, the driver who first discovered the fire and ran for his life, was not on that list. He had survived. What caused this global disaster? The truth, uncovered by experts, was shocking. Shortly after entering the tunnel, Gilbert had lit a cigarette, just as he always did. When he was finished, he flicked the butt out the window. That lit cigarette was sucked into the air intake on top of his refrigerated truck, igniting the air filter. The sparks were then carried to other components. By the time he noticed the fire, the margarine had melted and reached its ignition point, and the flour had caused a dust explosion. No accident, no deliberate flame, just a small habit that plays out in our daily lives. The aftermath was immense. The tunnel was closed for 3 years, for a $300 million renovation. Today, there are security checkpoints and thermal sensors at the entrances. There are strict rules for speed and distance between vehicles. A permanent fire brigade is stationed in the middle of the tunnel with advanced heat-seeking systems. The shelters are now sealed, with fire doors rated for 1,000 degrees and dedicated escape routes. Yet, the survivors and the families of the victims will never forget. In 2005, 12 people, including safety managers, were convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to short prison terms. The operating company was ordered to pay $17.5 million in compensation. Gilbert, the driver, was sentenced to 4 months in prison. In 2007, a memorial with 39 symbols was built near the tunnel to honor the dead and warn the living. For most of us, smoking while driving might seem like a small thing, but it is a violation of safety laws, as is throwing a cigarette out the window. If you ever find yourself in a tunnel fire, the most important thing is to run in the opposite direction of the fire and the smoke flow. Do not hesitate. Do not think you can outrun the smoke. The most deadly part of a fire is not the flames, but the smoke that robs you of your ability to move in minutes. Hopefully, you will never need these tips.